Hello everyone, Christiaan here. This is the third episode of Christiaan's Violin Ramblings. That's now the official title. I did two prior episodes. The first one about playing violin without shoulder rest, how to do that, and the second one about the bow hold I use, the Russian bow hold. Go check those videos out if you haven't. And based on the first video, I got some feedback. People wanted to know more about vibrato, because I was talking about vibrato in that video in relationship to playing without, as it relates to playing without shoulder rest. And in this video, I just want to talk about vibrato in general. And there's several things I want to discuss. The first thing I want to discuss is the importance of vibrato in violin playing across several styles. In some styles, it's more important than in others. Then I want to talk about the two main ways of playing vibrato, arm vibrato and wrist vibrato, and the differences and what I think about them, because I prefer one over the other. And then I want to talk about the mechanics I use for vibrato. And then I want to end with what I would call the 5 key components of vibrato. And if you have control over those 5 components, you could say you'd have a world-class vibrato. So the first thing I want to discuss is the importance of vibrato in violin playing, or in the sound of violin on recordings, in concerts. So the violin has a very long tradition, recorded tradition also, and also a tradition in concerts. There's so much repertoire written for violin for many centuries. The violin has always been a very important solo instrument. So we know, or it is known, how a violin is supposed to sound, especially in classical music. There are so many recordings of the repertoire. Same piece played by many different violin players, and although they might have different interpretations, and maybe they use different fingerings, or they play certain passages of music on different string, and they use different bowings, maybe they use different dynamics. But one thing they all do is use vibrato. Of course, I'm talking about romantic classical music. So if you play maybe Baroque or contemporary music, there might be different aesthetics as it relates to vibrato. But in romantic classical violin playing, it is known how a vibrato is supposed to sound. And if you would choose to record, let's say, the Tchaikovsky violin concerto completely without vibrato, that would be a daring thing to do, and that would be very interesting to listen to. But I'm not completely sure if it would be accepted in the violin community, which I'm not making any judgment about that. I'm not giving my opinion about that. I mean, it's just the way it is. If you want to play romantic repertoire, you need to have complete control over the vibrato. So that's in classical music. Now let's look at some other styles. Let's look at the style that I work in mostly, which is gypsy jazz. Gypsy jazz, the grandmaster of gypsy jazz violin, the first guy that did it, and the most well-known, of course, violin player in gypsy jazz is Stefano Grappelli. And as it so happens, he had this classical vibrato, and he seemed to be in complete control over the vibrato. He's coloring with the vibrato, he's using different speeds, different amplitudes, which is 2 of the ingredients that we'll go over later. So, if you want to be true to the tradition, let's say it like that, because also there's many recordings of Grappelli. The Hot de France recorded so many songs, and they are continually released. They just released a complete box set of all the Hot de France recordings remastered. Beautiful box set, get it. But then you can hear Grappelli play this beautiful vibrato across many years, across many recordings. So if you want to stay true to the tradition, you also need to develop this classical vibrato. Now, let's look at bluegrass. In bluegrass, there isn't this tradition of vibrato, so you can get away with in bluegrass by playing no vibrato, or have a kind of different concept of vibrato, more kind of a subtle coloring of the sound. Same is for Celtic music, For a lot of fiddle styles, let's call that fiddle styles, this command of classical vibrato is not necessary. And I have a theory about why that is, and I think the reason is that there is a big problem with learning vibrato, and that is that it seems to be completely unrelated to all the other stuff you can learn on the violin. And all that other stuff is related to each other. So, for instance, you can learn a lot of different bowings, very complicated bowings to very simple bowings, but knowing one bowing will help you learn the next bowing and the next bowing and so forth. And the same for the left hand. You can learn complicated shifts, you can learn to play double stops and difficult double stops, and you could teach yourself to learn to play in tune. You could play difficult fingerings. You could learn a lot of stuff with the left hand, but somehow they are all related. Learning one thing will help the next thing. Except for one component of the left hand, which is vibrato, which seems to be completely separate from all those other things. So it's easy to spend all your time learning more and more complicated pieces of music and just skip the vibrato, because it's so separate from it. So why would you spend a lot of time learning vibrato if it's necessary for the style that you're playing? And then you might say, well, how difficult is it to learn this classical vibrato? Well, for instance, in my case, I was classically trained, and then after some time I switched to playing without soloist. So I first played with soloist, and then without, I had to change my vibrato too, because I used to have kind of an arm vibrato, but playing arm vibrato without soloist I wouldn't recommend it. So I had to switch to wrist vibrato, so I had to learn vibrato all over again. And then I also discovered, listening to myself, that I actually didn't like the sound of my vibrato anyway. So I decided to spend 15 to 20 minutes a day practicing vibrato. And it took me the better part of 2 years to get a vibrato that I was happy with and that I thought sounded good on recordings in gypsy jazz. But also in classical, because that's the same vibrato. So if you play bluegrass and nobody is concerned about your vibrato, and there is also no teachers that really teach it, why would you spend that much time on vibrato if you could just spend that time on learning difficult, fast bluegrass pieces or more double stops? There's no real reason for it. That doesn't mean that you couldn't play nice vibrato in bluegrass. That sounds lovely, I think, but it's not necessary. So if you play classical or gypsy jazz, and also if you play Argentine tango, that also needs a very nice classical vibrato. Then you need to spend a lot of time on vibrato. And as I've said, it's a problem because it's so separate from the rest of violin playing. So now you have two types of vibrato, more or less. Arm and wrist vibrato. And it means exactly what it says. One vibrato you make with your arm and the other one with your wrist. So usually when you want to develop an arm vibrato, you lock the wrist and then you move your arm like this. And what you're trying to do, because it doesn't matter if you do arm vibrato or wrist vibrato, the thing that you're trying to do is play a note, and then let's take this D on the A string, and you want to go from a round finger to a flat finger. So you pull the note backwards, like this. So if I do it slowly, it sounds like this. And some people say, well, why don't you go up, like, so you have, now I go from below the pitch to the pitch, why don't you go up? Well, I'm not completely sure that is necessary, and it might happen anyway if you do vibrato. Maybe you go a little bit above the note, but my focus, or I think the focus in general, should be on doing this motion by flattening the finger and go back up to the note. Yeah. So that doesn't matter what kind of vibrato you develop, arm, wrist, or there's also something called finger vibrato, but you want to have this action. So you could do that by moving the arm backwards and forwards, and thus pulling the finger with you. Or you could do it, if you do wrist vibrato, you don't move the arm generally, and you rock the wrist to do the same thing, but the motion stays the same. So this is wrist, arm. And you could combine them, of course, you could do them both, but that's difficult to control. So I used to have an arm vibrato, and in fact most people have an arm vibrato. And it has an easy reason. The reason is that it's easier to develop an arm vibrato. As I said in the previous video, that it's much easier and faster to train large muscles than small muscles. So to train your arm to make this movement, you can do that pretty fast, right? So I'm not so good at arm vibrato anymore, but I will try to do an arm vibrato. You could develop that pretty quick. So let's say I give an estimate, if you would spend 15 to 20 minutes a day, I think you could develop an arm vibrato within a year. So it's the obvious choice to spend your time developing that. And the wrist vibrato, it's a more complicated motion because it's a smaller muscle, so it takes more time to train it. But here's the reason that I think that the wrist vibrato is preferable to arm vibrato. And that is because I have this rule, if it's a large motion, use a large muscle. But if it's a small motion, use a small muscle. Because if you lose a large muscle for a small motion, and you have to keep repeating that, and with vibrato you have to repeat a lot, and it's a fast motion, you need to lock like the small muscles while doing it. Because as I just said, if I do arm vibrato and I also keep this joint unlocked and then everything starts moving, it's difficult to control. So in general, what you try to do is lock this joint and then move your arm. I think if you lock joints, that's a recipe for injuries and pain. So I'm not making this up. A lot of people that have arm vibrato and have to do this vigorously, and now I'm talking about solo players, it sounds great, that vibrato. It can sound really luscious and virtuosic. It's also easy to control the speed, of course, because you could just shake faster or slower. But if you have a really fast, large amplitude vibrato, which is usually what great soloists strive for, then you need to lock this wrist, and I mean, they have a lot of pain. You can develop a lot of pain in your arm, and from the pain is the first step to injuries. And at one point you can't vibrate anymore, or you can't play longer than maybe an hour, after which your vibrato starts deteriorating. So if you're young, it's not a problem, and most people start learning to play the violin really young. So and then you're young, you're flexible, you can do that. But if you grow older and older, this becomes more difficult. So that's why I think that a wrist vibrato is preferable. You're making a small motion, use a small muscle. I do it by rocking back and forth the wrist. Now this motion is more difficult because it's a smaller muscle, it takes longer to train. But once you get it, it's easier to perform, or it takes less stress. You don't have to lock any joints, and I mean, you could do this until old age. So how long does this take? So I'd say if you practice 15 to 20 minutes a day vibrato, wrist vibrato, it could probably take you twice as long. So like 2 years to get it to a level that you're happy with it, or that it is considered to be, well, let's say very good, or maybe even world class. So now I want to talk a little bit about the exact mechanisms I use for my vibrato, which is based on a wrist, or it's a wrist vibrato, but you know, sometimes my arms moves a little, but it moves because I don't look at anything, so it might move because it's just moving because my body is moving, but I make the movement with the wrist, so that's important. I don't lock anything, but I move my wrist. Maybe my arm sometimes moves a little, but I'm not making the movement from the arm. So what I try to do is, as I said, I go from a round position to a flat position by rocking back, forth and back my wrist. So there are a couple of things that are important. Important is that you only have 2 contact points on the violin. So if you normally play the violin, you might hold the violin like this in this V. But if you want to do vibrato, you have to let go of this point here. There needs to be a hole. So now there's room for you to actually rock your hand back and forth. So how do I practice this? I practice this with a metronome. So I put the metronome, I start on 60 or 50 even, and on every click, so you have 2, 3, 4. You can do 8 notes. Triplets. And 16 notes. So and then you gradually speed up the metronome over time until you hit about 110, 120. If you can do 16 notes on 120, then you're in control of this vibrato. And you have to do this for every finger, because for every finger it feels different. And then you have to do it on every place on the violin. For instance, vibrato on the B flat, there's almost no room, so you have to really put your arm really far on the violin to be able to create a space here, right? But the motion is the same. But you hit this tuning peg with your hand if you don't make room for it. So it's complicated to do vibrato there. And for me, when I'm in the third position, I like to put my hands on the violin, and I don't know, it's easy to do. Sometimes I don't do it, sometimes I... So if you're high, it's the same thing. I focus on round, flat. That's another thing about wrist vibrato. If you do wrist vibrato, the motion doesn't really change if you're really high on the violin. But if you do arm vibrato, it becomes more and more difficult to move that arm vigorously vigorously enough to create the same vibrato sound. So that's another advantage of wrist vibrato. So you could develop this yourself by doing this exercise. I just want to stress that doing vibrato is very difficult. And you won't be able to do a nice vibrato for at least a year. After a year, it starts sounding better and better, but a lot of people give up before that, and especially if it's not needed for your style. But I think for gypsy jazz, which is my focus, it is needed. Now there are a lot of violin players in gypsy jazz that come more from the folk side or the jazz side, and they are masters of harmony. They can outline the chord changes when they improvise, but they might not necessarily have this sweet classical sound that Grappelli had. And there's a group of players that comes from classical music and is attracted to the sound of Grappelli, and they can already produce this sound, but they might not necessarily be very good at outlining the chord changes. Now, I think both components are important. Grappelli had both. He could produce his beautiful classical violin sound, and he could outline the changes like nobody's business and be bluesy when he wanted to and be sophisticated. But that group of violin players that can actually do both is pretty small. There's many more violin players that belong to one or the other group. Nothing wrong with it, it's just the way it is. But always remember that Grappelli could do both. So I think you should be able to do both. And I'll make more videos about outlining chord changes, but this video is about the sound, about the vibrato. So last thing I want to discuss is the 5 keys to world-class vibrato. So the first thing, and you need to be, so I'll say it's amplitude, speed, mastery over all the fingers. So you can do vibrato on all the fingers. You can do vibrato on in every position. I already discussed a little bit, like low, high, and you can start or stop with the vibrato when you want. So let's discuss all these things separately. Let's start with the amplitude. Amplitude means how big you make the vibrato. Right? If you are in control over the amplitude, it means you can make the vibrato smaller, which means you go back less, or bigger by going back all the way. So let's give an example of a vibrato with a small amplitude. Now big. And some passages of music, they ask for different amplitudes. It doesn't really, there's no rule for it, but if you can control the amplitude, you can play with the intensity of your vibrato, or with the impact of the vibrato. And it is closely related to the second component, which is speed. You can play a slow vibrato, or fast. And then you can combine the amplitude. So let's say I have a slow vibrato with a large amplitude. That's generally not preferred. That sounds like you're practicing. But let's do slow vibrato with a small amplitude. There's a place for that. In fact, I think if you didn't develop your vibrato to complete mastery, that's what you tend to hear. People that color the notes, this happens a lot of bluegrass, people color the notes with a slow vibrato with a small amplitude. Right? So then they play a lot of notes without vibrato, and they end on this note, and then they play a little vibrato there. You get this slight coloring of the sound, which is nice. So that was small amplitude, slow. Let's do fast amplitude with fast speed with a small amplitude. This is what I would call a nervous vibrato. I don't really like it if in ballads. For instance, let's say you play Manoir comme rêve, then I don't like this. I mean, it's not singing enough, but this vibrato is nice for if you have to play a lot of, like let's say you have to play a melody where you have quarter notes. Maybe you play In a Sentimental Mood, that song. Then you can use that vibrato on the little notes in that phrase. And then the last note, the last G can have a bigger vibrato, but for the small notes in between, you can use this fast vibrato with a small amplitude. Now do a fast vibrato with a large amplitude. That is, I think, the most difficult to do. Fast vibrato, large amplitude. And that is the vibrato that is the most singing. So in general, my strategy is to play fast, small amplitude on little notes, and then end the phrase with this luscious, big amplitude, fast speed vibrato. For instance. Wow, that's a little bit exaggerated. Let's do it again. So that last A and that high G had a large amplitude fast, and all the little notes in between had a fast vibrato with a small amplitude. So if you are in complete control over that, it's the first two key components to having a world-class vibrato. The third component is control over all the fingers, and here's where it breaks down for me. I have complete control over my vibrato on my first finger, which is a complicated finger, especially when it's very low. But I can do a large amplitude, if you can do large amplitude fast, then you can probably do all the other stuff too. So I can do that with the first finger. I can do it on the second finger. I can do it on the third finger. But I can't do it on the fourth finger. And I'm not alone in that. And the reason I can't do it on the fourth finger is I cannot flatten my finger like this. I'm not genetically, some people can flatten that. I mean, I can flatten the third finger, you see, I can do this. But I can't do it with the fourth finger, it just won't bend that way. I can do it when I push. So that means that I have to kind of cheat. So there's two ways for me to cheat. I can put my third finger down and let it help. But I mean, it works. You hear vibrato. But let's hear that note with the third finger. It's much more singing. Or I can do it, for instance, like Corpelli or Milstein, and have this kind of shape where my second finger is kind of in the air and the other fingers are also in there but lower. And then almost do this. So almost play two notes but really fast and with a somewhat smaller amplitude. It's okay, I mean I can get away with it, but if I have a choice I would always play those notes with other fingers. So I still work on it, but in general you can get away with having a little bit of a weaker vibrato on the fourth finger, especially when you play gypsy jazz, because you can always play those notes with other fingers. For instance, when you play Manuel Merev and you have F sharp A, that will be the fourth finger, right? But I would generally play 2-2. And I also have this nice slide there. But even if I have to play Danse Norvégienne, which is, let's say I want to have vibrato on that D2, now I could even do this. So I play 2, 2, you know, because you're free with the rhythm, so you can make one note shorter or longer. In classical music, it's more difficult, but in classical music there are also violin players that rarely use their pinky for heavy vibrato. So, I mean, I'm still working on it, but you can get by without having this great vibrato on the pinky. That doesn't mean that I'm very jealous when I ever see a violin player that can really flatten that pinky and have this great vibrato on the fourth finger. That's the third component. So the fourth component is that you can do it in every position. So you can do it low, but you can do it high. And so if you have the basic technique of wrist vibrato down, then that should not be a problem. What you should develop then is taste on which notes need what kind of vibrato. For instance, if you have a very high note, usually you need to not have a very big amplitude. So let's say I play, so I have to play in sentiment mood, but I play it octave higher. So this G, I would use a somewhat smaller amplitude, because if I do a really big amplitude, it becomes maybe not so tasteful. And really high too. Even smaller amplitude. So you got to work on developing the reflexes to play different kinds of vibratos in different positions. And the last component of vibrato, this is an important one and not discussed enough, is that you are able to start and stop whenever you want. And this becomes especially important when you want to connect notes. So for instance, let's say you play, what's the song called? Melodie au crépuscule. Right, so let's say I want to have vibrato on all those notes. It would be preferable if you can do that without stopping the vibrato. So let's see how it sounds if I stop the vibrato every time. right? Now I connect the vibrato. So the vibrato keeps going on, continuous vibrato, without stopping. This becomes even more clear if I play a slow melody. Let's say I play Mon Wagner Rêve, and I stop the vibrato, I stop and start every note. So. Believe it or not, this is what you hear a lot. Even a classical player, there are some classical players that develop this habit of stopping and starting every note with vibrato. So they play. You hear this note, ta, and then it starts vibrating. If that is your choice, then you should do it, of course. But you should be able to play continuous vibrato. And if I do that, then maybe I can make a choice to start one note without vibrato. Let's say I'm going to play a phrase. I try to do continuous vibrato, but then the last note I play of the phrase, I will play start without vibrato. Then it's a nice effect, right? I play this E and I put vibrato in there, but it's my choice. So being able to do this at will, and it's both a technical issue, like can you continue the motion while pressing fingers? You should be able to, because it's different motions, right? One is pressing down and the other one is rocking the wrist back and forth. But for some people that is linked. And so it's both a technical issue, but it's also listening to yourself and making decisions based on that, so that you don't make a habit out of one thing, like connecting every note with vibrato, or starting every note without vibrato. And that's the point where the phone stopped recording, I discovered during editing right now. But I didn't say much after that. I just said if you have questions, put them in the comments, and I'll answer them in the next video. And I'll try to be a little bit shorter also. Okay, see you later.